The question remains of whether we can corroborate the textual sources with the archaeological sources. Um, well, we can find at most potential candidates. Potential candidates we can consider sorcerers or prophetesses or something of the sort. And for this, we have either individual objects, which can be seen, could be seen as sorcery tools, or we can have potential sorcerers classified as such based on, for example, an unusual mortuary behavior. By objects, we mean here, for example, hammers or amulets or miniature chairs, staffs, especially staffs, narcotics, or other objects such as sickles and so on and so forth. So, for example, staffs, we have a quite a big record of staffs, either iron staffs or wooden staffs, but of course the iron staffs were the ones preserved, and we have 26 iron staffs in Viking Age burials, and 12 have been found, well, across the same region, but and they are stray finds. We also have a couple of staffs outside of Scandinavia. The problem with them is that their function tends to be a little unclear. So you have to look at the whole context, the general assemblage of these objects and how they can relate to one another. And then again, we have, of course, the problem of bad preservation, either bad preservation or the fact that they were badly recorded, because many of these graves, they were excavated in the 19th century, for example. Somebody made a record or a drawing of what they found in that grave, but then the grave was disturbed in one way or another, and you can't really make much out of it anymore. But I would offer you 4 examples of such graves, which can be, candidates, potential candidates at the status of sorcerer. So we're going to look briefly at the chamber graves, two chamber graves from Birka. There's 4 of them actually, and then we're gonna look at the grave from Fyrkat and the grave from Oseberg, and last but not least, I'm also going to show you a couple of interesting objects found in Aska. All right. So we have, first of all, the Birka chamber grave 660 from Uppland in Sweden, from Birka. It's a large chamber grave containing probably a female inhumation. The location within the cemetery seems to be north of the hill fort. Of course, these conclusions, as well as the later drawings, come from excavation diaries which stem from the 19th century. The graves seem to have had some post holes of unknown function, whether they had any function at all, and of the skeleton only the teeth remained. So any sex determinations are made through artifactual associations alone. And speaking of artifacts, it's a very interesting grave. We can find a lot of stuff here potentially connected, if we look at the whole picture, potentially connected to some kind of sorcery or some kind of higher function of this person. For example, we have a silver threaded silk band around her head. We have oval brooches. We have a thin silver chain, perhaps strung on the right hand. We have a necklace of 28 beads. Interestingly, we also have a silver granulated crucifix. That doesn't automatically mean that the person was Christian. And it had been probably strung with the beads, or perhaps attached to another silver chain. And we also have a clear glass bead strung on a ring of gold wire found near the woman's teeth. We also find here a belt with a couple of small objects such as an ear spoon, iron scissors, a pendant, apparently of Eastern origin, a whetstone, and an iron knife. And most importantly, we find across the woman's body, just below the waist, the iron staff. At the center top of the grave, above the woman's head, there was a wooden box, interestingly, with a beaker on top, a glass beaker. And in the western corner of the grave, you can see that in the picture as well, resting on the filled-in hole, there was a small ceramic vessel. So maybe these holes were more than just structures of the grave, after all. And there is also a large wooden bucket in the grave. Now, speaking of the cross could also be interpreted as an object of spiritual power, so something that would augment the powers you already have. There have been similar findings in Jylland in Denmark as well, for example. The dating is in the early 900s, at latest the late 900s. This is one of our candidates at the status of sorceress based on all these accumulated objects. But caution is to be advised with all these graves, because there is no certain way of confirming that these people were actually sorcerers. The other example is again from Birka, grave 845. Again, possibly a woman, possibly because we only have the skull. The location was in the cemetery, in the south of the cemetery, under a mound inside the town wall, because of the constitution of the grave, most probably this woman was buried sitting in a chair. And what we can find here are the following. So we have again a belt with a leather pouch, with a knife and whetstone, oval brooches, a large circular brooch, a row of coins, some oriental pieces, and a glass bead. Over her dress, because she wore a dress apparently, she was also wearing a woolen cloak, lined and trimmed with fur. The fur seems to have been beaver fur, and perhaps fastened with these circular brooches. And just like the woman from the previous grave, this one seems to also have a silver embroidered silk band around her temples. Right, and resting across the woman's knees, with its handle pointing towards the north wall, was an iron staff. We can also find an ornamented box here as well at the foot of the grave, and unfortunately we don't find, we weren't able to find, researchers weren't able to find anything here. So at the excavation there seems to have been nothing here. But the box does seem a lot like the box found in the Oseberg ship burial, where a similar chest was found. Perhaps there was some kind of equipment for cultic activities here as well. The dating probably in the mid 900s. So again, based on this whole assemblage, we might think this was also a sorceress of some kind. In Birka, by the way, there was also another very interesting grave. Unfortunately, I don't have it here, but there was an interesting grave with actually two people, a man and a woman, who seemed to have been buried one above the other in a chair, or in some kind of sitting position on a platform maybe. And interestingly, in the archaeological records, we can find a mix of um, artifacts normally associated with male and with female, although the two people were actually buried separately after they had been cremated. So maybe this was one of the couples of sorcerers mentioned in the sagas, maybe. All right, but then again, perhaps the most famous grave and the best candidate for the status of sorceress or prophetess is the grave from Fyrkat. This was in the Fyrkat fortification in Öland. This was one of the fortifications in the Trelleborg style, so the circular kind of fortifications ordered by Harold Bluetooth. And this woman seemed to have had a coffin from a wooden body, the wooden body of a wagon. That's very interesting. We also have a ritual wagon in the Oseberg ship burial. Right. The grave is of great interest because besides this wagon body, we also find some objects which might indicate the fact that this woman was indeed something special in society. So, textile remains she had a blue costume. Interestingly enough, she didn't have jewelry fittings on this costume, but there have been traces of a veil of linen. Also interesting is the fact that she didn't have any belt, but rather a series of silver wires holding some objects at her waist. Speaking of what made her special, she also had 2 silver toe rings and other relevant objects, such as a bronze bowl. This seems to have been of Persian origin. She also had a box brooch of the type found in the island of Gotland. And fascinating is the fact that this container, upon analysis, was found to have held a lead paste, which was used for makeup, commonly used for makeup. Maybe it had another use, but among other things, it was used for makeup as well. In her lap, we can find the following. She had a knife, a silver pendant, glass beads, a pendant with decorations in the shape of bird feet. She also had a pendant in the form of a chair. This can be interpreted as the high seat of the prophetess, for example. And you could also find what they also found in this grave was a small ampule with a substance with lead and calcium of unknown use, as well as some fragments of sheepskin pouch. And what they also found here were seeds, a lot of seeds of henbane. There is also an oak box with different clothing bits, with golden threads, with an iron hook, with shears, and on top of it there are some pretty bizarre objects. Bizarre in the sense that you don't really find them in any grave, and in this context at least. They found the jawbone of a pig and a bunch of pellets they initially believed to have belonged to an owl, but they were actually balls of bone and hair clumped together. And on her right are some elements which can point into the direction of her being considered a sorceress. They found an iron meat spit, as well as a wooden staff lying next to the meat spit and in parallel with it. But this staff could only be retrieved as a negative impression left in the iron corrosion. Right. And the staff, by the way, seems to have been very, very thin. So if she used it as a walking stick, That would have been very impractical. So, yeah, maybe ritual, maybe sorcery, could be. All right, so the last but not least grave I wanted to hint at is, perhaps a very famous one, the one at Oseberg in Oslofjord, Vestfold in Norway. It's famous because it's the richest. It's the richest single burial from the Viking Age ever found, and from the perspective of quality, it is truly one of a kind. But generally speaking, this grave is considered to have belonged to a queen and perhaps her servant, although the exact role of these women has not been confirmed. There is still debate about the occupants or the primary occupants and their identity. However, the grave also contains several objects that could be associated with the practice of sorcery. There is a potential link here if we refer to the tapestries, for example, and what is represented on the tapestries, because they include some elements relating to the worship of Freya and Odin, and they also relate to the topic of sacrifice. We can find here images of hanging men in a tree. This is the classical motif of Odinic sacrifice, and there are also women who seem to be going beneath a tree holding raised swords, and we also have some characters who seem to have been involved in some kind of shape shifting. We have armed men apparently wearing animal skins, and some curious figures who may be women using the heads of birds and boars. So we have all these motifs of sexuality, violence, transformation combined, which altogether could hint at the practice of sorcery. And this is further hinted at by the fact that Oseberg actually means the hill of the gods, the hill of the acid. So this would imply some kind of cultic function, although that's not confirmed. Right. And other elements going into the same direction would include the iron-studded chest with a couple of interesting artifacts, such as the iron lamps, also depicted on this tapestry. We can also find a staff here, and we can also find seeds of cannabis. Besides that, the grave also contains animal head posts, and the wooden wagon has some cats represented on it, cats being the animals of Freya. So the question that arises here is, perhaps this material we find in the grave was the material needed to reenact the whole scene depicted on the tapestry. So maybe the whole thing needs a little bit of reinterpretation in this key. All right, and in other graves, such as Aska and Klinta from Sweden, we find some figurines with unidentified purposes, but either way, these are rare finds, and because they are rare finds, we tend to consider them in some way related to cult or to magic. So, for example, we have this female figurine from Aska, seemingly related to fertility. Maybe she's Freya, maybe she's just a pregnant woman. Either way, it's a pendant with a female figurine. And in the grave of the person, there was also an iron staff, and in the same grave there was also another interesting pendant, this head pendant, which may be a reference to the talking head of Odin, the head of Mimir, the one he uses to ask important questions about the world. And from Klinta we have an interesting pendant depicting what seems to be a kneeling man, perhaps also engaged in some kind of ritual. All Right. From all the sources I've used, if you're interested in the topic, I would highly recommend the book of written by Neil Price, The Viking Way, Religion and War in Late Iron Age Scandinavia. Besides that, Ellis Davidson wrote a couple of books on myths, symbols, Scandinavian mythology, pagan Europe in general, and Ursula Dronke has very interesting commentaries about the Eddic poetry.